The night was eerily quiet, the type of stillness that made even the soft rustle of leaves seem amplified. A sleek luxury car sat parked by the roadside, its glossy black exterior reflecting the faint glow of streetlights. Inside, a teenage girl, her face illuminated by the pale blue light of her phone, was engrossed in texting. She appeared calm, her fingers tapping the screen rapidly as she messaged her friend about the party she'd just left. Unaware of her surroundings, she didn't notice the faint rumble of an approaching engine. From the opposite direction, a patrol car pulled up. Its lights weren't flashing, but its presence was undeniable. Out stepped a tall figure clad in a crisp uniform, the weight of authority practically visible in his stance. The cop's face was stern, his eyes scanning the luxury vehicle with a mix of suspicion and irritation. To him, the scene didn't add up, a high-end car parked on a deserted road, seemingly out of place. The driver, a young woman, only fueled his assumptions. Adjusting his belt and standing taller, he closed his car door with a deliberate thud, a sound meant to signal his arrival. He began walking toward the parked vehicle, his boots crunching against the gravel. His gaze remained fixed, his expression hardening with every step. The girl inside, engrossed in her phone, remained blissfully unaware of the figure looming closer. As the officer neared the car, his demeanor shifted subtly. His movements became more purposeful, his shoulders squared, exuding an aura of control. He was ready to assert his authority, no questions asked. Whatever this situation was, he would handle it. To him, this was just another night on the job. Little did he know this encounter would change everything. Emma was no ordinary teenager. At 17, she carried herself with a poise and confidence that often made her seem older than her years. She was the daughter of Police Chief David Miller, a man whose name commanded respect in the community. While Emma admired her father's unwavering dedication to justice, it also came with expectations she felt compelled to meet. Being the chief's daughter meant living under constant scrutiny, and while her father never explicitly said so, she felt an unspoken pressure to always do the right thing. That evening, Emma had attended a close friend's birthday party. It was a modest gathering, filled with laughter, music, and the lightheartedness of youth. Unlike many teenagers, Emma wasn't one to lose herself in the chaos of peer pressure. She enjoyed the evening, but by midnight, she decided it was time to leave. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a constant reminder to make responsible choices. Sliding into the driver's seat of her sleek black sedan, Emma couldn't help but smile. The car was a gift from her father, presented to her on her 17th birthday. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a token of their bond. David had spent months saving and planning for it, ensuring that Emma had a car that was both safe and reliable. The vehicle was more than transportation. It was a source of pride for her and her father, a symbol of trust and responsibility. As she drove through the quiet streets, the party's energy began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm. The road was empty, lit only by sparse streetlights casting long shadows across the asphalt. The hum of the car's engine and the rhythm of her favorite playlist added to the tranquility of the night. Emma rolled down her window, letting the cool breeze brush against her face. For her, driving at night was more than just a way to get from one place to another. It was an escape, a moment of solitude where she could think clearly without distractions. But tonight, her thoughts weren't entirely peaceful. Her father's work weighed heavily on her mind. As chief of police, David was a pillar of their community. He often worked late, tackling issues that ranged from petty crimes to deeply entrenched systemic problems. Emma admired his resolve but knew it came at a cost. Their family dinners were frequently interrupted by urgent calls, and their weekends together were often postponed for emergencies. Emma understood his dedication, but she couldn't ignore the subtle loneliness it sometimes brought. More than that, she felt an unspoken need to live up to his reputation. People in their town knew her not as Emma, but as Chief Miller's daughter. It was a title that came with its own set of expectations she wasn't always sure she could meet. She wondered if her father saw her as more than just a reflection of his ideals. Did he know her dreams, her fears, her individuality? Or was she merely an extension of his legacy? Lost in her thoughts, Emma noticed her phone signal had dropped. The quiet road she was driving on wasn't exactly a hub of connectivity. She decided to pull over briefly, hoping to get better reception and call her father. While they didn't always talk about personal matters, Emma made it a habit to check in with him after late nights out. She knew it gave him peace of mind, even if he didn't always say it outright. She parked the car on the roadside, turning off the engine but keeping the lights on. Picking up her phone, she tried to call, but the signal bar remained frustratingly low. She sighed and leaned back in her seat, scrolling through her messages while waiting for the connection to improve. The street was silent, with no signs of life apart from the distant chirping of crickets. Emma didn't mind the stillness. In fact, she found it soothing. She glanced at the dashboard clock. It was past 1 a.m. She knew her father was probably still awake, likely buried in work at his home office. He would appreciate hearing from her, even if it was just a quick call to say she was safe. Emma smiled at the thought of him gruffly pretending not to care, his voice betraying a hint of relief when she'd finally say, "Good night, Dad." As she adjusted her seat and tried the call again, Emma didn't notice the patrol car slowing down as it approached. Her focus remained on her phone, unaware of the events about to unfold. For Emma, this was just another quiet moment in her life. Little did she know, this night would become a turning point, a lesson about power, justice, and the very legacy she felt bound to uphold. Officer Mark Hargrove was the kind of man who wore his badge not as a symbol of duty, but as a tool of power. Known among his peers for his short temper and overbearing demeanor, Mark had built a reputation for being unnecessarily harsh, especially with those he perceived as vulnerable or out of place. To him, the badge was an extension of his authority, not a reminder of his responsibility to serve and protect. His colleagues avoided confrontation with him, and the citizens who encountered him often left with a lingering sense of injustice. That night, as Mark patrolled the quiet streets, he was in a foul mood. A minor disagreement with his superior earlier in the evening had left him feeling slighted, and he was itching for a situation where he could reassert his dominance. As he drove past a parked luxury car on the roadside, his gaze sharpened. The sleek black sedan gleamed under the streetlights, its pristine condition a stark contrast to the surrounding emptiness. To Mark, the car didn't belong there, and neither did whoever was inside. Slowing his patrol car, he scanned the scene. Inside the car sat a young girl, her head bowed slightly as she stared at her phone. Mark's mind raced with assumptions. A high-end vehicle, a lone driver, and late-night parking. It screamed suspicious to him, or at least that's what he told himself. In reality, it was the perfect opportunity for him to flex his authority. He parked his car a few feet behind the sedan, stepping out deliberately, ensuring his boots struck the ground with a firm thud. Adjusting his belt and resting a hand on his baton, he strode toward the vehicle. His posture was rigid, his expression sharp, and his eyes filled with suspicion. He tapped on the car window sharply, startling Emma. Emma looked up, her face calm but slightly confused. Lowering the window just enough to hear him, she said, "Is there a problem, officer?" Mark didn't answer immediately, his gaze flicking between her face and the interior of the car. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" he demanded, his tone accusatory rather than inquisitive. Emma, maintaining her composure, replied, "I was just making a call." "My phone signal dropped, so I pulled over." Her calm response seemed to irritate Mark. "A car like this? On a deserted road? At this time of night?" he said, his words dripping with suspicion. "That doesn't look like making a call to me." Emma furrowed her brow, confused by his hostility. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said simply. "This is my father's car. I'm just trying to reach him." Mark scoffed. "Your father's car? Sure it is," he said sarcastically. "And I suppose you're just a perfect little angel out here in the middle of the night, huh?" Emma could feel her pulse quickening, but she refused to rise to his bait. "I don't understand what the problem is. I haven't broken any laws." Mark's frustration bubbled over. To him, her calmness felt like defiance, a refusal to recognize his authority. Without further warning, he stepped back from the car and began circling it, inspecting it as though looking for evidence of wrongdoing. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the pristine condition of the vehicle. "Nice car," he muttered, his tone now laced with contempt. "Too nice for someone like you." Emma felt a knot of unease form in her stomach. "Officer, please," she began, but Mark cut her off. "Step out of the car," he barked. Emma hesitated, unsure if complying would de-escalate the situation or worsen it. "Now!" he ordered, his voice louder and more aggressive. Reluctantly, Emma stepped out, clutching her phone. She stood by the car, her composure intact but her heart racing. Mark loomed over her, his expression unreadable but his posture intimidating. "What's in the trunk?" he asked, not waiting for a reply before walking toward it. "Drugs? Stolen goods?" Emma's voice wavered slightly as she protested. "There's nothing in there. This is my father's car." Mark's lip curled into a smirk. "Right. And your father is who? Some big-shot lawyer? A politician?" Emma took a steadying breath. "My father is the police chief." Mark froze for a split second, then laughed. A cold, mocking sound. "The police chief? That's a good one," he said, shaking his head. "You really think I'm that stupid?" His laughter quickly faded, replaced by a simmering anger. To Mark, Emma's claim felt like a direct challenge to his authority. Fueled by frustration and arrogance, he acted on impulse. He grabbed his baton and smashed the rearview mirror, the shattering glass punctuating the still night. Emma gasped, stepping back in shock. "What are you doing?" she cried. Mark ignored her, moving to the windshield. With deliberate force, he scratched the glass with the baton, leaving deep, jagged marks. "Let's see how your dad feels about this," he sneered. Emma's protests fell on deaf ears as Mark punctured the car's tires one by one, the hissing sound of escaping air mingling with her pleas. Each action was deliberate, fueled not by duty but by his own arrogance and frustration. By the time he was done, the once pristine car looked vandalized, a stark contrast to the calm and quiet that had preceded his arrival. Mark stood back, his chest heaving with exertion, a twisted sense of satisfaction on his face. "This is what happens," he said coldly, "when you mess with the wrong officer." Little did he know, he had just made the gravest mistake of his career. Emma stood frozen by the side of the road, her heart pounding as she stared at the destruction unfolding before her eyes. The once pristine car, a cherished gift from her father, now bore the scars of the officer's rage: shattered mirrors, deep scratches across the windshield, and deflated tires that sagged against the asphalt. Her voice trembled with both anger and desperation as she repeated, "This is my father's car." "You don't understand what you're doing." Officer Mark Hargrove smirked, his baton resting casually against his shoulder as he surveyed his handiwork. "Your father's car?" he repeated mockingly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess. Your dad's some big-shot CEO or maybe a Hollywood director? Spare me the fairy tales." Emma clenched her fists, fighting back tears of frustration. "He's the police chief," she said firmly, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "Chief David Miller. You've heard of him, haven't you?" For a split second, something flickered in Mark's eyes. Hesitation, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by a sneer. He laughed, a harsh, hollow sound that echoed in the still night. "Oh, sure," he drawled, stepping closer to her. "And I'm the President of the United States. What a coincidence, huh?" Emma's stomach churned as she realized her words were falling on deaf ears. Mark was too consumed by his own ego to listen, too blinded by his authority to consider that she might be telling the truth. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Mark shook his head, his smirk widening. "The only mistake here," he said, gesturing toward the damaged car, "was you thinking you could pull off whatever stunt you're up to. But don't worry, I've got it under control." With that, Mark reached for the radio on his shoulder. He pressed the button with exaggerated confidence, the smugness practically radiating from him as he spoke. "Dispatch, this is Officer Hargrove. I've got a situation out here," he said, his voice dripping with self-importance. "Suspicious individual, luxury vehicle, roadside. Seems like some rich kid up to no good. I'll need a tow truck to take care of this mess." Emma's jaw tightened as she listened, fury bubbling beneath the surface. "You don't have to do this," she said, her tone sharper now. "Just call my dad. He'll explain everything." Mark turned to her, his expression one of mock surprise. "Oh, you mean your dad, the chief?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Why not? Let's give this imaginary dad of yours a call." I could use a good laugh. Before Emma could respond, Mark pulled out his phone, still smirking as he scrolled through his contacts. "Let's see here. Chief Miller, right?" he said, the name rolling off his tongue with exaggerated emphasis. He tapped the number and held the phone to his ear, his expression gleeful as he awaited the reaction he was sure would vindicate his actions. On the other end of the line, Chief David Miller answered, his voice calm but authoritative. "This is Chief Miller." Mark straightened slightly, his voice dripping with feigned professionalism. "Chief, this is Officer Hargrove. I thought I'd give you a heads up about a situation I'm handling. I've got a suspicious individual in possession of a luxury vehicle, claims it's yours, believe it or not. Thought you'd want to know." There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the faint sound of rustling papers. "A luxury vehicle?" David repeated, his tone sharp now. "Black sedan?" Mark's confidence faltered slightly. Yeah, that's right. Why?" David's voice grew colder, each word laced with restrained anger. "Because that's my daughter's car, Officer Hargrove. And if you've laid a hand on it—" Mark's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of dawning horror. "Wait, what?" he stammered, gripping the phone tighter as if the connection itself could change what he'd just heard. "You heard me," David said, his voice thunderous now. "That's Emma's car, my car, and you'd better have a very good explanation for what you've done." Mark's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, words failing him for the first time that night. He turned to look at Emma, who was watching him with a mixture of vindication and disappointment. "She's your—" he started, but the words caught in his throat. "Yes," David snapped, "and I'm on my way. Don't move a muscle, officer." The line went dead, leaving Mark standing there, his face pale and his confidence utterly shattered. For the first time that night, he felt the weight of his actions, not as an enforcer of authority, but as a man who had grossly overstepped his bounds. Emma crossed her arms, her expression resolute. "I told you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm that cuts deeper than any shout. "You've made a huge mistake." Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. The damage was already done, and there was no undoing it now. All he could do was wait, dreading the moment his superior arrived to face him. Chief David Miller hung up the phone and stared at it for a moment, his jaw tightening as the implications of the call sank in. His daughter's car, late at night, and Hargrove, of all people, had been the one to handle the situation. Fury simmered beneath his calm exterior as he grabbed his keys, his mind racing with a mix of anger and concern. He trusted Emma implicitly, but the idea of her being at the mercy of a man like Hargrove sent a chill down his spine. David pulled out of his driveway with precision, his years of disciplined driving kicking in automatically. His thoughts, however, were anything but calm. He knew Hargrove's reputation: hot-headed, power-hungry, and prone to overstepping boundaries. As a leader, David had worked hard to instill a sense of justice and fairness in his team, but he also knew that some officers saw the badge as a tool for dominance rather than service. Tonight, it seemed, Hargrove had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. The drive to the scene felt longer than it was, every minute stretching endlessly. David gripped the steering wheel tighter, his foot pressing the gas pedal with more force than necessary. He replayed Hargrove's smug tone over the phone, his dismissive attitude toward Emma's rightful ownership of the car. The arrogance, the disrespect. His jaw clenched as he imagined Emma standing there, likely bewildered and scared, while her car was being vandalized by someone who should have been protecting her. As David's car approached the site, the damaged vehicle came into view first. The sight made him inhale sharply. The rear-view mirrors were smashed, the windshield bore deep, jagged scratches, and the tires were completely deflated. It was a heartbreaking sight, his carefully chosen gift for Emma reduced to this state of disrepair. Then he saw her, standing on the roadside with her arms crossed, and her expression a mix of defiance and indignation. She looked unharmed, which brought him a small measure of relief, but the tension in her posture told him everything he needed to know about the ordeal she'd endured. Near her stood Hargrove, his back to David, shoulders stiff, oblivious to the storm about to descend on him. David parked his car and stepped out with a commanding presence, his every movement calculated. Even without saying a word, he exuded authority, the kind that made people stop and pay attention. His polished shoes hit the pavement with a deliberate thud as he walked toward the two figures. Emma's face lit up with a mixture of relief and vindication. "Dad," she called, her voice steady despite the emotional whirlwind she must have been experiencing. Hargrove turned at the sound of her voice, and the moment he saw David, the color drained from his face. His smug demeanor evaporated, replaced by a mix of confusion and panic. "Chief Miller," he stammered, his voice faltering as he took an instinctive step back. David's eyes locked onto Hargrove's, his gaze cold and unrelenting. "Officer Hargrove," he said, his voice measured but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Would you like to explain what I'm looking at?" Hargrove opened his mouth to speak, but no coherent words came out. He glanced toward Emma, then at the car, as if hoping for some miraculous explanation to present itself. "Sir, I thought," he began, his words trailing off under the weight of David's stare. "You thought what?" David demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut through the night air. "That you could destroy someone's property without cause? That you could intimidate and harass an innocent young woman because of your assumptions?" "I didn't know it was your daughter, sir," Hargrove blurted out, as if that detail somehow absolved him of responsibility. David's expression hardened. "So if it wasn't my daughter, that would make this acceptable? Is that what you're saying?" His voice rose slightly, the fury he had been holding back beginning to seep through. Hargrove stammered, "No, sir, I thought she was up to something suspicious." David raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with disdain. "Suspicious? You mean parked on the side of the road, making a phone call, in a car that clearly doesn't belong to her, because you decided it didn't?" Hargrove's shoulders sagged, his attempts to justify himself falling apart under David's scrutiny. "I made a mistake," he admitted weakly, his eyes darting to the ground. "A mistake?" David repeated, his voice icy. "This isn't a mistake, Hargrove. This is a complete failure to uphold the very principles this department stands for. This is arrogance, prejudice, and a blatant abuse of power. Emma watched the exchange silently, her confidence growing with every word her father spoke. She had never doubted his integrity, but seeing him defend her so fiercely was a moment she would never forget. David turned his attention to Emma, his voice softening slightly. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" She nodded. "I'm fine, Dad. Just upset." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning back to Hargrove. "I'll deal with you formally in the morning," he said, his tone final. "For now, consider yourself suspended, effective immediately. Leave your badge and firearm at the station before the end of your shift." Hargrove swallowed hard, nodding as he muttered a quiet, "Yes, sir." David didn't wait for further response. He turned to Emma again. "Let's get you home," he said, his voice filled with both reassurance and regret. "We'll take care of the car later." As the two walked back to David's car, Emma glanced over her shoulder at Hargrove, who stood motionless by the ruined sedan. For the first time that night, he looked small and powerless, a stark contrast to the man who had so brazenly wielded his authority just moments before. For Emma, it was a moment of vindication. For David, it was a grim reminder of the work still left to do in the fight for justice. The morning after the incident, the precinct was abuzz with murmurs. Word of Officer Mark Hargrove's actions and Chief David Miller's involvement had spread like wildfire. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, many wondering how the usually arrogant Hargrove would face the consequences of his actions. Few sympathized with him. His reputation for overstepping boundaries was well known. Most, however, felt a sense of pride that their chief was addressing the issue head-on, reinforcing the integrity of the badge. David entered the precinct with his usual calm authority, though his steely expression made it clear that today was different. He carried a folder under his arm, its contents detailing the events of the previous night. Inside his office, Emma sat waiting, her posture straight but her hands fidgeting slightly. She had insisted on coming with her father, wanting to see the resolution firsthand. "Are you sure you want to stay for this?" David asked her gently, placing the folder on his desk. Emma nodded. "I do. I need to see how you handle it. It's important to me." David studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "All right. Just remember, this isn't about vengeance. It's about justice." Emma smiled faintly. "I know, Dad." Minutes later, Hargrove was summoned to the chief's office. He entered with a mix of apprehension and defiance, though his usual bravado was noticeably absent. His gaze flickered briefly to Emma before landing on David, who gestured for him to take a seat. Hargrove hesitated but complied, his discomfort evident. David sat across from him, his posture relaxed but his eyes piercing. "Officer Hargrove," he began, his voice steady, "you are here today because your actions last night violated the core principles of this department and the trust placed in you as an officer of the law." Hargrove swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, David raised a hand, cutting him off. "You will have your chance to speak, but first you will listen. Last night you destroyed private property, intimidated an innocent civilian, and misused your authority. Worse, you did so without any valid cause or evidence. Your behavior was not just a lapse in judgment, it was a blatant abuse of power." Hargrove lowered his gaze, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. "I didn't know it was your daughter," he muttered. David's voice hardened. "That is irrelevant. Whether it was my daughter or a complete stranger, your actions were inexcusable. The badge you wear is not a license to intimidate or destroy. It's a responsibility, a commitment to protect and serve. You failed that commitment." Emma watched silently, her respect for her father growing with every word. He wasn't just defending her. He was standing up for the principles he had spent his entire career upholding. David continued, "Effective immediately. You are suspended from duty. There will be a formal internal investigation, and I have no doubt the review board will make the appropriate recommendations for disciplinary action. You will also personally reimburse the cost of the damage you caused to the car." Hargrove looked up sharply. "Sir, You are not in a position to argue," David said firmly. "This is non-negotiable. Consider yourself fortunate that the charges against you aren't more severe." Hargrove's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally settling on him. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. David leaned forward slightly, his tone softening but remaining resolute. "You have a choice to make, Mark. You can reflect on this and learn from it, or you can let it define you. But know this, if you ever misuse your authority again, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose any chance of regaining the trust of the community and your colleagues." Hargrove nodded mutely, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Dismissed," David said, his tone final. As Hargrove exited the office, Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was incredible," she said softly. "You didn't just protect me, you stood up for what's right." David turned to her, his expression softening. "Emma, it's my job to protect everyone, not just you. The badge I wear represents justice, not power. What Hargrove did was wrong, and if I let it slide, I'd be failing everyone who looks to me for leadership." Emma's eyes welled up with emotion. "You've always told me to do the right thing, even when it's hard. I didn't fully understand what that meant until now." David placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's not always easy, but it's necessary. Remember, Emma, integrity is what you do when no one is watching. It's standing for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." Emma nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "You're an amazing leader, Dad." David smiled, pulling her into a brief hug. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot." Later that day, David held a department-wide meeting, addressing the incident with transparency. Standing before his officers, he delivered a powerful message. "We wear this badge to protect and serve, not to abuse power or harm others. This uniform is a symbol of trust, and that trust must never be broken. If we fail to hold ourselves accountable, we fail the very people we've sworn to protect. Let this be a reminder. Justice begins with us." The room was silent as the weight of his words settled over the officers. Emma watched from the back, her father's words echoing in her mind. It was a moment she would never forget, a lesson in justice, accountability, and the power of doing what's right, no matter the cost. The events of the previous night played on a loop in Emma's mind as she sat by the large bay window in her living room, gazing out at the quiet street. The chaos had subsided, but the emotions lingered: anger, fear, relief, and above all, a newfound clarity. She turned the events over in her head, dissecting every word, every action, and every moment that had unfolded under the stark streetlights. Emma had always admired her father, but the depth of his values and commitment to justice had never struck her as profoundly as it did now. Growing up as the daughter of a police chief, she was no stranger to the demands of his profession. She had seen him miss dinners, cancel vacations, and sacrifice personal time to respond to the needs of his community. She understood that his work required tough decisions, but last night she saw more than a police chief. She saw a man who stood unwaveringly for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant disciplining one of his own. Her fingers traced the edge of her coffee mug as she thought about Hargrove. The man had wielded his authority with such arrogance, acting as if his badge gave him the right to trample on others. She wondered how many others had been on the receiving end of such abuse, people who didn't have a father like hers to step in and make things right. A chill ran down her spine at the thought. Emma sighed, her reflection staring back at her from the window pane. Last night could have been worse, far worse. What if her father hadn't answered his phone? What if he hadn't believed her? These questions left a bitter taste in her mouth. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her father's response wasn't just about protecting her. It was about protecting the principles he had sworn to uphold. The memory of his words to Hargrove echoed in her mind. The badge you wear is not a license to intimidate or destroy. It's a responsibility, a commitment to protect and serve. He hadn't spoken those words for her benefit alone. He'd spoken them as a reminder to everyone who carried that badge and as a lesson to her. Emma closed her eyes, letting the weight of the lesson settle in her chest. Her father could have easily swept the incident under the rug, dismissed it as a misunderstanding, or even used his authority to shield her from the fallout. But he hadn't. Instead, he held Hargrove accountable, not because it was easy, but because it was right. That was the kind of leader her father was, the kind of person she wanted to be. Before last night, Emma had viewed justice as something abstract, something her father enforced at a distance. She had never fully understood how much courage it took to uphold it, especially when the stakes were high. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their position or privilege, was treated fairly. She thought back to her own reaction during the confrontation with Hargrove. She had felt helpless at first, but as the night progressed, she found herself standing her ground, speaking up for herself even when the situation seemed hopeless. That, she realized, was her father's influence. He had taught her to stand firm in the face of injustice, to believe in the power of truth and integrity. A faint smile played on her lips as she remembered the hug they had shared in his office after Hargrove's suspension. Her father's words echoed again. Integrity is what you do when no one is watching. It's standing for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. She had heard him say similar things before, but this time they resonated deeply. They weren't just words. They were a way of life, a principle to carry forward. Emma stood and walked to the garage where her car, her father's thoughtful gift, now sat damaged but still standing. She ran her hand along the hood, feeling a wave of gratitude. This car wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of trust and responsibility, a reminder of her father's belief in her. It had been tarnished last night, but it wasn't ruined. Much like the lessons she'd learned, its value lay not in its perfection, but in what it represented. Her reflection in the car's glossy surface stared back at her, and for the first time she saw someone stronger, someone who understood the weight of justice and fairness. She saw her father's influence in her resilience, his values mirrored in her determination. Emma straightened, her resolve hardening. This incident had changed her, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. It had opened her eyes to the realities of power, privilege, and the importance of holding people accountable, not just for others, but for herself as well. Walking back inside, Emma picked up her phone and opened her notes app. She began typing, her thoughts flowing freely. Maybe she couldn't change the world overnight, but she could share what she'd learned. Her father had taught her that justice starts small, with one person standing up for what's right. And if she could be that person, even in the smallest way, then the lesson of that night would have been worth it. With a deep breath, she typed her final thought. Justice is not just a concept, it's a choice, and it begins with us. She hit save, feeling lighter and more certain of who she was meant to be. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds in Chief David Miller's office, casting soft streaks of light across the room. He sat at his desk, his demeanor calm yet contemplative, as he carefully reviewed the formal report of the previous night's incident. The words on the page were stark reminders of the flaws that still existed in the system he worked so hard to uphold. Yet they also represented an opportunity for change, a moment to reinforce the values that his badge symbolized. Emma entered quietly, a hesitant smile on her face. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice soft but steady. David looked up, setting the report aside. "Hey, sweetheart," he replied warmly. How are you holding up? Emma shrugged lightly as she took a seat across from him. Better. Last night was a lot, she admitted. But I've been thinking about everything, and I feel like I understand things a little differently now. David leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. What do you mean? Emma hesitated, searching for the right words. I guess I never really understood how much responsibility comes with the badge. I mean, I've always known what you do is important, but seeing how you handled Hargrove, it made me realize it's about more than just enforcing rules. It's about setting an example, being fair, and standing for what's right, even when it's hard. David studied her, a mix of pride and emotion flickering in his eyes. You've always been wise beyond your years, Emma. But you're right. This job isn't just about authority. It's about accountability. Every decision we make, every action we take, reflects not just on us, but on the entire institution we represent. That's a heavy responsibility, but it's one we must carry with integrity. Emma nodded. You didn't have to take it as far as you did with Hargrove, though. You could have let him off easy. David sighed, his gaze steady. I could have, he agreed. But what would that have taught him? Or anyone else in the department? It's not enough to say we believe in justice, we have to show it. Every single time. He leaned back, his expression softening. Hargrove's actions were a betrayal of what it means to wear this uniform. If I'd let that go, I'd be betraying not just my oath, but the trust of the people we serve. And that trust, Emma, is the foundation of everything. Emma absorbed his words, her admiration for her father deepening. You always make it seem so clear, she said. I don't know how you do it. David chuckled lightly. It's not always clear. Sometimes it's messy, and sometimes it feels impossible. But at the end of the day, I remind myself of one simple truth. True power lies in justice, not in oppression. Emma tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. That's a good way to put it. David reached across the desk, placing a hand on hers. It's not just a good way to put it. It's the way I live, and I hope you carry that with you too. Whatever path you choose in life, remember that doing what's right will always matter more than doing what's easy. Emma nodded, her heart swelling with both pride and gratitude. I will, Dad. I promise. David smiled, his grip tightening briefly before he let go. That's all I could ever ask. As they sat in companionable silence, the sound of faint chatter drifted in from the precinct outside. David glanced toward the window, where the golden light of the afternoon cast long shadows. He stood and motioned for Emma to follow him. Together they stepped outside, the sun warming their faces as they stood on the precinct steps. David gestured toward the bustling city beyond. This, he said, his voice thoughtful, is why we do what we do. It's for them, for everyone out there. No matter who they are or where they come from, they deserve to feel safe and respected, and it's our job to make sure that happens. Emma followed his gaze, her own thoughts drifting to the events of the night before. She saw the world differently now, not as a place where power was absolute, but as a space where fairness, accountability, and justice could truly make a difference. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about striving to be better. The two of them stood there for a while, letting the moment sink in. Finally, Emma turned to her father and said, You know, Dad, you've taught me a lot over the years, but I think last night was the most important lesson of all. David raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on his lips. And what's that? Emma smiled back. That justice isn't about the badge, it's about the person who wears it. David's smile widened, his heart swelling with pride. I couldn't have said it better myself. As the scene faded, the camera lingered on the father and daughter standing together, their silhouettes framed by the golden light of the setting sun. The image was calm, yet powerful, a symbol of unity, integrity, and the enduring fight for fairness. A closing narration echoed David's words. True power lies in justice, not in oppression. The screen faded to black, leaving the audience with a sense of hope and a call to reflect on their own actions, their own choices, and the kind of world they wanted to create.